Thank you, everyone, for helping start 501c. This is our second episode, and you will see some exciting announcements to build out the community online and possibly in the real world over the next few months. I'm Pam Zerpeli, and I'll be your monitor today. The idea behind 501c is simple, yet it has a huge goal to improve the impact of nonprofits by using data in two simple ways: to make decisions and take action. Showing data to make it look pretty or say, see a few KPIs doesn't move the needle. And because nonprofits are generally open to sharing their data, the community as a whole can learn much faster. We have a lot of groundwork to cover, so let's get started. In addition to Lee Feinberg, the leader of 501c, we have Eric Steiner and Alex Boscovich as co-presenters from the Alameda County Community Food Bank. Eric and Alex, thank you so much for being here. Alex Boscovich is a member of Alameda County Community Food Bank's advocacy team. She is responsible for cultivating strong partnerships with government, private institutions, and organizations to pursue policy, systems, and program changes that achieve the food bank's mission of ending hunger and promoting thriving communities. She holds a master's in social work from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Eric A. Steiner is a data analyst and works with ACCFB to improve their data analysis systems and processes to ensure that the organization is better able to assess the need of its communities and the efficacy of the organization's work. Eric holds a master's in urban planning from NYU. A little about Lee Feinberg. Lee has worked with Tableau since 2009 and started DecisionBiz in 2012. Today, he's going to take you through his design to act framework, which is quite different from how you might be used to working with analytics. Lee treats making decisions and taking action as the stars of the story, and data has a supporting role. A few housekeeping items. You'll be on mute until Q&A, so feel free to put questions into chat. You will also receive a link to a recording of the session in about a week. Okay, so now I will hand over the session to Lee.
Great. Thanks so much, Pam, and hi to everyone who's joining us today and those who'll be watching the replay in the future. So just to give you a little bit of background on what 50C is and what it means to me, and there's three things that are personally important to me that are the intersection of those items. One is the work I've been doing with nonprofits. Two, the work I've been doing with something called the Tableau Foundation, which some of you might be familiar with. And the third is running somewhere over 80 Tableau user groups since about 2010. And one day those ideas just came together in my head and started to form this idea that what we're pursuing now. So today, Eric, Alex, and I are going to spend about the first 15-20 minutes and just having a conversation about their work. And I'll tell you right now, they have no idea what I'm going to ask them. This is not rehearsed. And the key here is, before we start digging into the work they've been doing in Tableau and their data, all of us really have to get an understanding of why they're even doing this. What was behind them starting their work in Tableau? So once we know that, then we can actually go in and start looking at the data and the workbooks that they developed, and then figuring out over that next 15-20 minutes how we can take them to another level, and then we'll have 5 to 10 minutes at the end for some Q&A. So Eric and Alex, you ready to jump in?
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Great. All right, so let me just put this up here. give us a little bit nicer background to look like than that. All right. So first would be helpful just for everybody to get a little bit of an idea about your work and the kinds of problems that you're trying to deal with through the food bank. So just give us a little bit of background on those kind of things.
Sure. So this is Alex. I'm a member of the Food Bank's advocacy team, and thank you to all who are on this webinar today and helping us to grow and learn. So for those who aren't familiar about Alameda County Community Food Bank and our region, Alameda County is in the San Francisco Bay Area. We like to refer to ourselves as the sunny side of the Bay. And our organization, despite having a very booming economy around us and low unemployment rates, the food bank serves a very immense need. We are supporting 1 in 5 people in our county with meals. And our organization operates through a network of 200 plus agencies. And when I say agency, I just want to clarify for the audience, an agency can be a soup kitchen, it could be a volunteer distribution out of a church, it could be a domestic violence shelter. And in fact, over 40% of our agencies are solely volunteer run, but they helped us to distribute more than 35 million pounds of food in one of the most prosperous parts of the country. So I want to, put that out front and center to lay the foundation of why we're going to be talking about voter engagement. Because for the food bank, core to our strategy with ending hunger is a commitment to not just following policy, but really helping to shape policy and grassroots voice in ending hunger. We know that we're not going to end hunger by getting more grocery bags out into the community, that it's going to take leadership and voices from every sector, every part of our county to make sure we have thoughtful and equitable policies and legislation for people living in poverty. So currently, we, on July 1st, launched our new strategic plan, where we're beginning to ask this question across the organization about who are we not serving. And so as a member of the advocacy team, working with different public institutions, I'm really focused with this project on 3 points. One, which is we're going to strengthen the nutrition safety net through first, government accountability. Secondarily, in order for us to advance our policy fight to end hunger and poverty, we need to have real grassroots power. And thirdly, to ensure equitable conditions for our community, we need to do that in partnership. So looking to really invest in coalition building, and our hope is through this data that Eric has put together, we'll be able to do that, to engage both policymakers, but also community thought leaders and the public itself. So as a GR person, I'd put together a voter engagement plan. Our food bank has done voter registration in the past, but we really wanted to double down on this particular strategy. And so core to that plan, in addition to trying to register folks through our volunteer services and having really clear messaging that supporting the food bank means being civically engaged, that's just as important as donating or volunteering with us. But a central tenet of this project is about identifying really specifically geographic gaps in our clients' voice at the polls and cultivating partnerships with local leaders, organizations, and other really key institutions in those communities to provide both voting resources and support in the long term so that our community of clients and neighbors have equal representation and sway in our government.
So it looks like kind of that key statement that we see on the screen here about how incoming and current voter turnout ties to exactly what we said.
Correct.
Eric, anything you want to add?
No, I think that Alex really perfectly kind of give you a kind of an overview of why this is important work for our organization, and so we kind of just wanted to kind of start digging into kind of the data and how it can kind of support that vision.
Excellent. So let's jump into some of the lines of questioning here and find out a little bit more about how you actually go about doing what your work is and driving to some of these things that you're trying to decide about the voter. How do you get more people out to your voter voice?
Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead. I didn't know if that was a question, but go ahead.
No. I'm gonna ask you. I'm just moving down to what I wanted to ask you. Make sure.
Okay.
So, this might sound a bit strange, but this is one way we try to get people to think differently about the problems of working with their data, and rather than focusing on the data, like we're saying, focusing on what you actually do. And of course, in the world of nonprofits, there's this idea of impact, right? Everybody's focused on the impact. So let's just say your data was hacked, okay? And it's held for ransom. Now, this hacker's not all bad. They have a show of good faith. They said they'd be willing to release one set of data to you. So what are you going to ask for out of this set of data that you've got right now?
I think specifically to get to like a better understanding, like really not understanding as the whole Alameda County, but specific neighborhood, specific areas. What we would most importantly need is the voter turnout for each precinct.
Okay, that's great. So now tell me a little bit more about why you chose that.
I guess the reason that I would want to see that is because precincts are fairly small. I think if I remember this correctly, there's a little bit over 700 precincts in Alameda County. So they're pretty small geography sizes. So we can basically, we're looking at that, we can get a pretty good estimate of like certain neighborhoods, certain areas that would be more manageable to kind of be able to look into or kind of assess than kind of just say in Alameda County. So that's why I would think that would be an important data set to have.
Interesting. Okay, so it's a lot of little areas to look at, and it sounds like from what Alex was describing, part of this is going to be how do we target the right one. So there's out of that 700, you might have not only which ones to target, but then trying to figure out different programs for them. How is that going to work? You talk a little bit more about that. So let's just say you had the data, right, on these. What is it that you would be looking for that would help you decide, is that an area you want to go after, and what kind of messaging or program that you want to put in around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were only able to secure the precinct data and its correspondence to voter turnout, we know hopefully what would not be hacked is I mentioned a network of 200 plus agencies. So we could use that almost as a proxy for poverty and to see, where we have low voter participation, do we have, for example, an agency there? Do we, for example, partner with a school in that precinct to help us narrow our focus in this? And again, this particular project is focused in client voice. And that's not to say that other voices at the polls are not as important, but within the advocacy team, we're really rooted in the belief that food is a basic human right, and that's actually across the organization, but that those who are experiencing food insecurity and poverty, their voices are often least heard. And so that's where we as advocates and supporters want to make sure that resources are more equitably distributed there. So.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain a little bit more about, you said that at the precinct level, you could use understanding the agencies as a proxy for poverty? What is that? How would you do that?
Sure. So I would probably honestly either bug Eric to create a map for me to overlay the agency on top of the precinct, or, use a zip code, or actually go. My background's in community organizing. Actually go walk the neighborhood and see. When I see, for example, a precinct with, let's say, 50% voter turnout, actually going into that community and seeing what are the resources there, who are the key leaders or assets of that particular space in our county that we can work in partnership with. So perhaps there is an agency there, but also maybe there's a library or a school or a clinic. But just to understand more deeply, what does it mean to have a voice at the polls in this area, and what can we do in the long run to encourage civic engagement?
So it sounds like what you're saying is the fact that there is an agency is somewhat of an indicator that there's a need, and so that there is some level of poverty to address.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
got it.
And the census data is public, so I'd probably just go around that hacker and try and access it myself.
Good analogy, right? As you think about some of these things.
Yep.
And so, what have you learned so far from now that you've got, and now pretend you have all your data back and you're all in good shape. What is it that you've learned so far that maybe you've been able to act on? And how has that turned out?
So one of the great things that came from, doing this work is that Alex and I were able to identify 32 precincts in Alameda County where there seems to be a higher rate of poverty, and then lower voter turnout. And the way that we kind of came up to this, and I want to give a couple caveats about some of this data. There is no income data for precincts, right? Precincts are kind of a whole different world than zip codes where you can't find income. So some of it we needed to kind of stitch, data together to kind of give us an idea, but it's definitely not in any kind of exact science. So we took data from the census data of the 2016 5-year ACS, the American Community Survey, and then took the income data that's kind of put out on there. You can put zip code and know what the median and the average household income is for that area. And then we can also look at housing burden, essentially how much of somebody's income in that zip code is going towards income, going towards housing burden, which is like your rent, your mortgage, things like that. And the one thing, I guess, what we looked at is that we thought that initially, this is a very surface level kind of analysis, is that we would see that overall, generally, low income neighborhoods would have really low income, really low voter turnout participation. But overall, it kind of was a mixed bag. Some places, some neighborhoods, some zip codes that had low income had really high voter turnout, and others had like really low, even if the income was, very high in some of those places. So we didn't really see anything there that we could specifically say, yeah, all low income neighborhoods had low voter turnout. We kind of needed to dig a little bit. And the two markers that we kind of used to kind of dig was to look at the population, the voter turnout for all of California, which was about 75%, and then the voter turnout for the national, for the whole United States as well. And it's kind of looking at that smaller number that I guess the national voter turnout, which is about 60%, is then we're like, well, let's just identify the neighborhoods that are below that 60% and kind of dig into those.
So you had a bit of a benchmark.
Yeah. And I mean, and two things about those kind of voter turnout, I think kind of from looking at the data, we realized that general elections, which are usually presidential elections, have a higher voter turnout than midterm elections. So, that could impact things as well. But yeah, we just kind of thought that those would be good kind of barometers to kind of see kind of where Alameda County and the precincts in Alameda County stacked up.
Okay. So now this was at the out of these 700 precincts, you got down to to 32. Now, were those 32 the ones you picked that were below this threshold, or that when you went down even further?
No, those are the ones that were below that threshold.
Okay.
That 60%.
I would add one of the interesting things is once we kind of, distilled it down to those 32 precincts and took a look both at the voter turnout but also voter registration, then we got to see more of the complexity. So, for example, in one particular zip code where we know there's high poverty, we actually saw really high voter registration but very low voter turnout. And then in other neighborhoods, you kind of saw, low voter registration and low voter turnout. So now we're in that kind of phase of looking at the data and thinking about, okay, how does that, change our strategy, change our partnership work, and change our resources that we're able to commit.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So now you had these 32. Have you actually started to do anything against that, or you're just at the phase where I got these 32, and you're in the planning phase of what comes next in terms of how you're going to engage all these different assets that you have?
I think that's exactly where we are. We identify these places. Now we're kind of in that planning stage, and I think one of the things that really excited me about reaching out to you is it's one thing for Alex and I to kind of see this and understand that, but I think one thing that's really important to us is that we're really able to kind of tell that story a little bit better, right? Or how can we tell that story better to essentially get people on our side, people to kind of get motivated to kind of, work with us and some of that.
Right. And so out of that 32, so I always joke that, I'm only able to do one thing at a time. My wife and I have a laugh about that. And so now you've got these 32, and let's just even take Alex's example, which was really interesting. She said maybe she would just get out and walk the community to understand what's going on there and get literally a street level view. So if you have this list of 32 and you said, I'm going to go out and I want to hit all of them on foot, how would you pick the first one? How do you decide that? Is there something else that you're looking at to help you figure out how to actually start as part of that program?
Yeah, absolutely. So our food bank is really fortunate that we have a 5-person policy team overall, and 8 if you include the research end of things. But in terms of, thinking about how many steps I'm going to get in for the day, I think when Eric was mentioning, being in that planning phase and thinking about our own capacity, right? I mean, I'm okay in terms of my fitness, but would be first to run that data through, okay, what existing organizations and resources exist, and thinking about, for example, one of these precincts is Cal State East Bay, where we have a number of partnerships, both through our equity work, but we also have an on-site college pantry. So trying to think about, who by extension is with us already, right? Mm-hmm. And can kind of, give us the cliff notes of what's going on and get their recommendations and their feedback versus, hey, this is truly an under-resourced area. We don't even have an agency here. There's not even a school. So let's go out and walk. So that's kind of where we're at, is trying to do some of that internal mapping of our capacity and our partnerships. And the next phase actually of this project, once we do that sort of planning, is to invite key stakeholders from these 32 precincts. I mentioned, Cal State East Bay. There are other organizations like workforce developers, health clinics that we know have an interest in civic engagement and voter work as a part of their strategies for supporting people living in poverty and ending poverty. So we're actually looking forward to sharing this data and this better story that we hope to tell with them, to get their feedback and to think how they kind of conceive both the issue and the solution, and again to generate that hive mind and do that coalition work that I was mentioning earlier. So
I think that could be really interesting because then you're not just showing up, you're explaining to them also what if you have all of those folks in the room, they actually share something in common from what you've seen, right? And so they may actually be able to bring more specific things out verbally.
Exactly, and hopefully this is movement building, right? Used the word program earlier in the talk, and for us it's the fall election is a very specific target and an objective, but for us it really is is the work is centered in client voice and a culture shift. We all have to start somewhere, and so this is a really important first step.
Great. So I think that's a good start for now. So let's take a bit of a quick look at what you've got and see which of the pieces start talking about what you've already said, so we can hone in on that just as a beginning here. Because I took a look through, and I want to make a couple comments to folks as we go through, and to you as well. We'll hit on some of the higher level concepts to see how the story's unfolding, but we'll also talk about some of the visual aspects here as well, because they go hand in hand. And what I always talk about with my clients is that until we understand what you're trying to show and why, we can't figure out the best way to show it visually. Once we decide that, then we also have to adhere to understanding how people will actually consume that information visually. So I want to make sure that I raise a couple of those things, because I saw a few pieces in here that I think would be helpful and good examples of for people to see. So the first thing I want to say, Eric, it was interesting to see how you started to really take advantage of a lot of the visual pieces in Tableau, where you tried to combine some of the more complex features. So I get a sense that you have started, a really good understanding of some of those capabilities and actually the underlying, how do you use Tableau, which I think is good. So as once we're done here, I think you can start to maybe take some of what we talk about and actually be able to use it, which is wonderful.
Fantastic. So,
yeah. So I think that's always helpful. So here it looks like you're just kind of giving people an understanding of the turnout, which I guess is voter turnout. So that's a good start, just to understand what's here, because you talked about that.
Voter turnout by city, that is.
Right.
Those different cities there. So.
Cities, and then we have it down at we go here. Now here, are these the 32 precincts that were?
No, these are essentially kind of where I did here, and this is kind of where it starts becoming a little, not the exact science that I prefer it to be, but these are all the average turnout of all the precincts that are in those zip codes.
Oh, all the precincts. So there's multiple. Okay. Got it. Makes sense. So where do these zip codes are what then?
All zip codes are within Alameda County, inside Alameda County.
Oh, these are all the zip codes. Okay, so we're still just kind of looking at the lay of the land here. You haven't gotten anything too deep yet. Got it. And then we got some income I saw here. Right. And we've got location, which I definitely want to come and talk about in a bit. Yep. And then under 60%. So that's what you mentioned before about who comes in under that, which is great. And then there's a follow-up here. Okay, so let's go back, and I want to think about so one thing I want to point out to folks, let's look at this. And this is we'll actually go into this worksheet here. Okay. One thing I saw, so this is just a point to make, a couple things. One, when you're working with here you're using gradients, so that's just for folks, that's the range of colors that we see over here. And you're also trying to give people a sense of the size through using this feature in Tableau called a tree map of the same value. So a lot of times I just like to pick one. So over here I could see you're using the same value to color and to size here in the tree map. Mm-hmm. So what I prefer to do is, and I'll always like to make a copy. Oh, sorry, just I hit the wrong thing on my screen. Like to make a copy of anything I'm going to change. So if you were just to talk to people about this, it might be easier to do something like this with a bar chart.
Mhm.
And then we could go in and label these values with percentages. Something like this maybe. And maybe not even need the decimals. Something along this line. And then it would give you a nice clear ranking of those groups. One other reason to do something like this is on this view, if you wanted to keep this, I would probably take out the color because they represent the same thing.
Right.
So a lot of times what happens if people see two pieces of information, they tend to think that they're not necessarily the same, but that they're related in some fashion. So now they're trying to figure out, well, how does the size relate to the shading? When in fact they're the same thing.
Correct.
So we don't want people to start guessing or getting distracted by things like that. Yeah. But just as something to make it simpler, you could go with this.
Yeah, no, I like that bar graph a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah. Now bar graphs, you don't want to use them too much because then sometimes if you have a lot of bar graphs, it gets kind of boring to people too. So you kind of have to pick and choose, but something where you get a lot of information like what you had there, maybe we'll see if it works out better as we kind of go through here. So is this the first, so if you think about what you would tell people, I'm trying to imagine you have all those people in the room. Probably the thing that would be most interesting to them is to see a map, I think. That makes a big impact, especially it kind of eases people into not thinking it's too much about the data yet.
Yeah.
So I want to go, I don't know that we'll use this one, but let's take a look at the map you had over here.
Yeah.
So you had this map, and what was going on here? What was the kind of the point behind this one?
So this is again kind of voter turnout by percentage. And all those dots are individual precincts within Alameda County, right?
Okay.
And one thing that I put in that, I think, it was kind of to separate the precincts by the ones that were below 60%, the ones that were below 75%, and then kind of the ones that were above that as well.
Okay. So you were trying to do that by doing some kind of like using the shading again? That was the, okay. And then over here I saw you had this, okay, lower, were these just some other ways to manipulate it by?
Right, correct. So here on that where you were right there, you can like press that little arrow and then they give you like the kind of a list of like the ones that are under 60%, the ones that are in between, and kind of all of them then.
Okay, that makes sense. I like that idea. So what's really good here is since you said there's like below the was it below 60%?
Yep.
And then what were the other two kind of markers?
The ones that are essentially in between there, between 75 and 60%, and then all of them, I guess.
Okay. And then all. Okay. So one thing to do here, rather than using this range of values, which is kind of what you're doing here, is to actually mark off those three zones. So there's a couple things going on there. Since you're really just trying to identify those kind of three barriers more clearly, it would make more sense visually just to show them that way rather than the range, because now I'm trying to think like, well, where's 67%, right? I got to kind of figure out where it is in that range kind of thing, right? So that's one thing we can do. So let's take a look. So average turnout percentage. So let's see. So we have turnout percentage here, right? And you want to use the average of this, right?
Right.
So if we do something like this, let's create a calculated field. And let's call it I don't know, turnout or boundaries. So here we could do something like if the average turnout percentage is less than 40, then we'll say there's other ways to do this, but I think this is the clearest way. Else, if average and then what was the other one? Greater than 75?
Yeah, essentially anything above the 75%. Yeah, yeah. So it was the ones that are below 60%, and then anything above 60% up to 75, which was like kind of the other marker, which was the average voter turnout for the state of California.
I have to make these decimals too. That would be smarter. Else, I don't call it in between. Hopefully type this okay. Tableau says that I didn't type anything wrong. That doesn't mean I typed it correctly, but let's see what happens here. So now, let's get that out. We've got our turnout color boundaries. So now I'm just going to drop that over here into, first I want to make a copy. I always duplicate that page. And let's drop that over here and see what happens. So now it seems like it didn't even find anybody in between, which is interesting. Because clearly, well, do we even have anybody that size? It's possible maybe you don't have anything under 40 in here?
Yeah, I think, I think that's true. I think the lowest one was 46 or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, so should we change the formula here? Should it be under 60 instead of under 40? Right. Oh, okay. So let's do that then. Sorry, got the wrong. Too many numbers flying around here already. There we go. I saw a couple guys sneak in there. Yeah. Now, what we don't really need, I would also say let's get rid of the size.
Right, okay.
Right, because we're just looking at the range. And now...
Hi, Lee. Just to let you know, next time when you do a formula change, just for the group, maybe it went to your second screen, if you can just show the calculation when you're doing it.
Oh, you didn't see any of the calculation at all?
No.
Oh. Let's go back in. So that didn't pop up, huh?
It did not. Is it on your second screen?
I only have one screen.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Okay, you'll have to watch the video to see it. So that's kind of strange. Let me just do one thing here, see if this makes a difference. Any difference?
Not on my end, no.
Okay.
One suggestion is that maybe you have the window shared instead of your full screen that you're presenting in.
That's possible. Let's see if we can do a quick adjustment on that. If I can. Just give me a second, folks, and see if I can figure out how to make a quick adjustment here. I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure how to do that, so I will just continue. And
Yeah, that's okay, Lee.
I will learn that for the next time.
Yeah, you could just share the calculations later on after the presentation. That'll be great.
Great. Thanks for letting me know that. So you may not see me popping up the color box here now too. I'm not sure. Or do you see that?
So we don't see that. So
Okay.
we'll just, that's okay.
So what I'm doing now, I'll just walk you through it. I'm just adding I'm just going to add a little bit of a border to these so you can see them a little bit better maybe. And then I'm just going to make them a little bit see-through. So I'm going to change the opacity just so if we get some overlap, things like that. So it would give us a chance to play around with a little bit more. So now what the hope here is it's a little bit clearer where you can very quickly see where these are. And one of the nice things that I think you already have turned on in Tableau up here is the highlighting feature. So for folks who don't know about that, now we can click through each of these sections. So if someone was in the audience, say, well, I want to see each of those, that's one way to do it. Now, another thing that's possible, again, depends on how you want to go through this with your audience. Another thing you could do is we could, instead of just showing the color split out on here, we could actually take that and do something like this.
Oh.
Okay. I'd probably want to zoom in a little bit on these maps. Oop, not like that, though. We'd have to go. So we might be able to zoom in a little bit more into that particular area. Let's see if we do that. Oh, but we're just going to edit those out, so we don't want to do it that way either. So we'd have to get in a little bit better on that particular geography. But this way, it might be better than trying to see where they're overlapping like we were before. And you can see more specifically how they cluster without things getting buried under each other.
Right.
So it might be another way to look at it. And now let's talk about some of these other, let's go back and see something else you might want to talk about with these folks, because there were a few things in here that there was a lot going on, and I want to address that.
Sure.
So on this page, and this might be our final view, and then we might get into some Q&A. So let's talk about a few things going on here. First, I want to hit the thing that got to me first when I soaked this in was, of course, my eye was drawn to the colors that were ongoing. So something here that you did, which was interesting, kind of like what we just did with the, where we split up the groupings into the three, is you tried to do that here in a way, just by using Tableau's built-in feature to just make it into 4 blocks in that range. Except that here you kind of have them reversed. So I was now trying to figure out, well, does this one go here with this line, or does this one go with it, or vice versa? So just one thing for folks to be careful of is how you use these colors in certain ways, just to make sure they don't overlap like that, since people it will be a little bit confusing to folks when they look at it. Now, as I think through your audience, I can imagine people there might not be that into data like we are. What do you think is most important for them to see? Because here you're talking about population and precincts, right? So over here we've got population, and here are the different precincts. And we've got the turnout, which I guess is this line here, right? And so I think probably here again, let's actually go into that view. This one feels like maybe, yeah, let's take a look. So color, you probably don't need the color on that because it's the same thing again, right? voting age, population. Oh, that's the blue. Oh, that's the blue.
Blue, right.
Okay. And then the turnout. Yeah. So we could get rid of that. Something. Just keep that simpler. And then you've got this. Now, this is how you're showing that relationship, I guess, right? That it seems that in certain precincts, well, this is just more by precinct. It's not really. Here you got count of precinct. Yeah, so talk me through this one a bit, because I think there's something interesting going on here.
All right, so I think this is where I wanted to compare that. So the census does have the number of individuals or the population that would be eligible to vote in that zip code.
Okay.
So again, here's kind of where it's a little shaky in the sense is that what I did is just like, well, I can only aggregate that by the number of precincts that are within that zip code. So I added those numbers together, essentially, the average of those numbers.
Okay.
Then we wanted to see kind of what the voter turnout was by that.
Got it. Okay, so there's something here. So there's a couple interesting things going on here. One is a kind of a data conception issue, and then one is maybe we can find a different way to show this. So one thing here, what I went through before I read what was going on, and frankly, a lot of people don't always read, even though we think that they are. The first thing I saw is that this was like, oh, wow, what's this trend line? Okay. But it's really not a trend line, right? Because it's really just, you're just counting across zip codes, and there's not any particular kind of, certainly not a time relationship between these or any, and these zip codes aren't organized in any particular way. So that's one thing that could be a bit confusing to people, is like trying to figure out that it's showing some kind of trend, but it's not.
Right.
So just to try to avoid that. Now, I copied the page, and here's something that I think could be interesting, but I don't know that I would show this to people. I'd have to think about this some more if I'd want to show it to your general audience. But I think from somebody who may be a smaller, more analytic audience, maybe you would go with something like this, where we'd show an XY plot. And you might not have seen me pop up the show me window, since you guys we're having trouble seeing that come through. So what we've got here is instead, now I can see the count of the precinct, which you had, and the population, right? But now what I'm able to see is what those relationships are, and then I could go in and look at the exact zip code. So here I've got one that's way out, right? And I said that could be they got what's going on there,
right?
Or I've got some that are way down here, right? And so this gives me a better sense of what the relationship is between those two values. And the reason I thought about this one, and there might be other ones to explore, but anytime I hear people talking about wanting to show two values and how they're related, I always think of an XY plot, because it helps you see how things might be grouped together or not. Now, what could be interesting here, and I'll stop talking a second and ask you a question. Is there anything in here that has, well, you have city, but do you have anything that's by, oh no, city might be interesting, because these are by zip code.
Exactly.
So you might, if you put, now you've got, how many are here? It's about a dozen or so, maybe a little more. It's a little bit more colors than I like to use, but since we can use the highlighter, maybe I could look and see where some of those are and see if there's any kind of, like, this is interesting, because look, in Hayward, you've got them all over the place. In Sunol, you've got just, looks like one down there. Union County, looks like maybe it's that one. Fremont. So you might be able to break this up in a way, like here again, Livermore looks like they're a little bit scattered. So you might be able to start getting some interesting insights by seeing how things are grouped together or not, even across the different cities, right? You might see some anomalies, like, wait, and maybe those zip codes are maybe far apart, or maybe two of them are close to each other, but they have different values in here, which would be also really insightful to know that within the same city, two places that are close to each other are acting very differently.
Right.
So how would you interpret, does this something like this make sense to you in this way versus, say, trying to look at it this way? Because
Yeah.
I don't know what's inside your head either, because you have a certain way to think about it.
I agree. I think because again, in that goal of like trying to get, because we have a capacity constraints, right? We can't be in all of Alameda County. We want to be very specific about where we can have those partnerships and focus our efforts. I think breaking it down like this, and I think this last point that you brought up on kind of seeing the behavior within different cities and how that would change, that would be really, really, really valuable to us. Because I think that's, when we talk about Alameda County, it's just a big place. And unless we're able to kind of get down to this level and actually even more granular, it's until we do that, it's not going to be very much help for us. But this is great. I think this is a better way to put it.
Great. Well, I see it's got about 5 minutes left or so. So Pam, maybe do you have any questions coming in on the chat?
We have no questions. Anyone out there have any questions? You can put them in the chat. Or
Otherwise,
you can just continue on for the next 5 minutes.
Yep, we're just going to keep going. We don't have anybody breaking in. That's great. That way we'll get some more out of it here. Let's go back to this view where we started and see what we've got here. So now let's take a look at this one too. Let's go into this and see what we've got. Maybe we can do one more build out for this view. Quickly. So walk me through this. So we've got average turnout percentage. So we've looked at that a little bit. And then we've got the zip codes again.
Yep.
And then, it looks like you maybe have your markers here.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
75 and the 60.
Right.
Okay.
And and it's like kind of like, as kind of just looking over, we wanted to see if any like zip codes were really below those different markers, right? That 75% average California voter turnout, and that 60% national average turnout.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense. So one thing we already talked about is I would just remove the coloring from that, because again, it's redundant. And there's a couple things. There is one thing you could do, actually. We actually already created this, so we might be able to steal it over here. So we could do that. Remember, we built this one already before to show the 3 ranges. So this would help you distinguish those a little bit more. And that would be consistent if I don't know that I love the yellow, blue, or red, and the orange, blue, and red scheme, but you could pick 3 different colors to represent these. Because this is your kind of your hot spot in here, right? I guess,
Right.
Is the blue.
The blue, especially the red, obviously.
And the red, yeah. So maybe you would even color this one like a gray, because like you don't even care about that one as much. So maybe you mute it a little bit, say, yeah, let's not worry about that, but let's focus on these two. And then one other thing you could think about doing, so I'm not in love ever with vertical text. It hurts my head.
Yeah.
So there's a couple options. One, here you probably don't have the space to rotate these, right? We could. So we've kind of run out of space. Right. So another option, I broke my rule here, forgot to duplicate the page. One option is to use this little feature up here called swap. And all that does is basically it just swaps the axes here. So it changes out the X for the Y and vice versa. And so one thing there is and if we just make it fit the entire view, it makes it easier to read the whole text here. And if this was longer, of course, then it would be easier if this was the name of a county or a city or something like we have before. So this is another way that you could consider doing something like that. And then you could put the labels here. We could take the text, make those percentages again. Percentage, squash that down, and then we could even, you could change this, say something like average voter turnout, and then you don't even need this down here, something like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's pretty much the end of our time. I know we got through 3 or 4 views here, which was great. I think we have had some good discussion back and forth, and hopefully this will start to gel a little bit more and clarify how you can present this information, simplify it down so that not only for yourselves when you're discussing it internally, but if you start to think about how you're going to show this to a broader audience that might not be so, day to day with information, it won't completely, push them back right away.
Absolutely. No, that's a great suggestions there.
Alex, any closing words here about how this you think can help you out a little bit?
I think it's just, especially when you're speaking to a non, technical audience, right? Folks like me who don't know how to go into Tableau. I appreciate it. I appreciate the simplification piece, especially for the page. I think it was the population and precinct, stepping back and being like, I totally saw that blue line and thought, is that a trend? And so I think being able to step back and just keep it really simple. I like the use of the 3 shades because, again, a lot of this work is about, tiering our outreach. Like, how much are we going to have to do where and when? So some good overlying strategies on that.
Yeah, it's a good start. And I would encourage anybody who's listening, if you have found yourself being drawn into this discussion today and maybe even want to work with Alex and Eric and spend some of your time helping that community, I think that they'd love to hear from you as well.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
All right. Well, Eric and Alex, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Pam as well, and everybody who's been joining us today. Look for the replay and feel free to share it with folks, and keep an eye out for the next episode for sometime in early August.
Great. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.